Hey everyone, Cara here. And before we even dive into the show today, I just wanted to give a shout out to Podcorn for sponsoring this episode. I love Podcorn. You may or may not have heard me talk about them before, but I work with Podcorn on a regular basis with my show. So if you're a podcaster, whether you're just starting out, you're interested in starting out, or you're pretty established, I know that you're going to love Podcorn. It's a marketplace connecting podcasters to great podcast sponsorship opportunities like host-read ads, interview segments, topical discussions, and a whole lot more. And of course, there's no middleman. Podcasters of all sizes can browse and choose opportunities right through the platform. You can set your own rates and you can collaborate with brands directly without any exclusivities. And you never give up any rights, of course. I use Podcorn all the time. Like I said, many of the brands that you've heard me shout out on the show, I was connected to through Podcorn. So why don't you try it out? All you've got to do is visit podcorn.com/podcasters, explore sponsorship opportunities, and start monetizing your show today. That's podcorn.com/podcasters. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, April 25th, 2022, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible week after week. Remember, this show is and will always be 100% free to download. I rely on the support of listeners just like you and also my ad partners to make sure that I can keep producing this show completely free of charge. So those of you who do support the show, I give you a heartfelt thank you. I do want to give a shout out to the top supporters via Patreon. If you're interested in pledging, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. This week's top supporters include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, Dudas Infinitas, Gabriel F. Jaramillo Gonzalez, June Sapara, Leonard Prince, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. Okay, let's talk about this week's show. So I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Ashley Ward. He is the director of the Animal Behavior Lab at the University of Sydney, and he focuses on social behavior, learning, and communication really across the animal kingdom. He recently wrote a book, and we're going to chat all about that. It is called The Social Lives of Animals. So without any further ado, here he is, Dr. Ashley Ward. Well, Ashley, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I am excited to talk about your new book, The Social Lives of Animals. You know what? It's kind of rare to have a book that doesn't have a subtitle. I just noticed there's no subtitle, just a title.
Yeah, well, it did have a subtitle when it was in its audio form, but then we just decided to go with the headline.
I love that. We don't need a subtitle. Do we need a subtitle? I don't think so. The Social Lives of Animals really does describe what it is that you study in your day-to-day work, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I've been incredibly fortunate to be able to travel the world and to study lots and lots of different species of animals. And that's the one thing that connects them all, their sociality, their tendency to live in groups.
And so would you describe, obviously animals are social, as you said, their sociality. Do they have society? Do they have that larger thing that comes from social relationships?
Oh, that's a great question. So some do and some don't. If you take, for instance, a huge shoal of sardines or a great big flock of starlings, that isn't a society in any sense that we would recognize it. There's no structure within that. There's seldom any kind of a dominance hierarchy or a pecking order, that kind of thing. But then there are other societies where they very much do have these kinds of organization. So think about social insects, where they've got all these different castes within there. They have a reproductive caste that we sometimes refer to as a queen or a king, soldiers and workers and so on. So that definitely is a society. But most animals fall between that kind of extreme organization and the complete lack of organization that we see in fish shoals. So there's some organization, but not, it's not completely organized.
And is that what some researchers, or I might even say science communicators and science writers, would refer to as like culture within animals? That there are certain species that kind of have a culture, and there are other species that don't really sort of, I don't know, pass on knowledge to later generations?
Well, there you go. So I don't think you necessarily have to have a huge amount of organization to be able to have culture. So
Mm,
there are some instances, for instance, among groups of fish where there is a cultural transmission of information, even though the societal organization isn't particularly strong. There's one particular study on a fantastically named fish called a French grunt. And they'd travel in shoals around the ocean. And they have particular routes that they've followed, like traditional routes between their foraging and resting areas. And this is an experiment that was done some years ago now, but the experimenters removed some fish from those traditional areas, from their existing shoals, and transplanted them into different shoals to look at how they communicated these traditional routes, and found that even though it wasn't necessarily the most efficient or effective route between the two places, the new arrivals in a group took on those traditions, and the ones that had been transplanted out were then somewhat lost. I mean, so there was cultural transmission even in an animal as simple as a fish. We tend to think of culture in terms of animals such as particularly mammals. We know there's plenty of evidence for
yeah.
culture in whales or primates, but yeah, even in fish you see culture. So there you go.
And do we really kind of I mean, I know these are probably just complete and total constructs that we as human beings develop to try to make sense, to try to, you know, put a taxonomy on the natural world. But when we talk about sort of culture, is what defines it the fact that a smaller group of individuals have knowledge or wisdom that they pass on that somehow differs from the larger species?
Yeah, that tends to be the way it works. I mean, we usually define culture as a group or population specific pattern of behavior which is transmitted between generations, I guess. So, yeah, what you often find is exactly as you say, you get some experienced, often older individuals who have learned from previous generations, and they're the conduits through which the information gets passed to the next generation. So, yeah, I mean, you even used to see that in cod, at least before cod were fished out. You'd always get the large and knowledgeable individuals leading the big migrations, and between the Grand Banks and the Arctic, they would always be the ones that were leading. But the same is true, of course, in many mammal species as well. The elders tend to lead. Same with migrating birds. Um, it's yeah. So very much as you say, it tends to be the preserve of the older, more experienced individuals, and it's their job to pass the information on to subsequent generations.
Yeah, I feel like I've seen examples, but very often, as you mentioned, in mammals and very often in cetaceans, of kind of like hunting behaviors that are very specific to this one group that live only in this one area and they've learned how to use this one tool. And it's such an
Yeah.
obvious example of culture. But I can imagine that there are examples all over the place that we simply aren't really attuned to.
That's the wonderful thing about researching animals. The more you look, the more you find out, and you start to see these incredible things that perhaps no one else has ever seen before. And it's just it absolutely lights up your week, when you see something like that. I mean, not that it was me, but one of the best examples of this is from an area of sea on the west coast of Australia where dolphins in Shark Bay, they noticed that female dolphins would teach their calves particular foraging tricks. So one of them is what's called sponging. So the female gets a piece of sponge in her mouth and uses that to protect her rostrum, a sort of like her beak, as she grubs around in the rough substrate looking for buried fish. And they teach that to their offspring. But living side by side with them are other kinds of foraging innovations that, in turn, mothers who are associated with that particular feeding style teach to their calves. So you get, even in the same population in that case, you've got, animals doing different things, living alongside each other, and cultural transmission of different aspects going on all the time. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, I remember when I visited the Peruvian Amazon, and yes, I happened to visit right as a friaje was hitting, which is like a storm that comes down from the Andes with cold air, and a lot of the animals are like, "Boop, don't like that, gonna go and hide." But regardless, the biodiversity, as we know, is like the highest on the planet. Yet, for the first like 2 days that I was there, I was like, "Where are all the animals?" Like I didn't see anything, I didn't hear anything. It felt quiet. And only after being on these long hikes for hours on end with these guides and them pointing out all the little, at night you could see the eyes of the spiders kind of shining up at you, and you could see the eyes of the caiman in the water, and you could hear the different calls of the different species. But I'm a city dweller. I just didn't even see it. It was right in front of me.
Isn't that incredible? I mean, I'm so jealous that you went to the Amazon, but I had a similar experience. Just a couple of weeks ago, I traveled from Sydney, where I live, up to the north. If you imagine a picture of Australia, the kind of the horn on the right hand side as you look at it, right up the top there in Queensland. And I went to a place called the Daintree Rainforest, which was glorious. But after about 2 or 3 days of looking, it felt like the animals had gone on holiday to Sydney whilst I'd gone up there. I could hear them, but I couldn't see them.
Yeah.
But,
They're really good at hiding,
oh
aren't
my
they?
God, are they ever? It's astonishing. Yeah.
And
But
then it helps you understand why field researchers such as yourself have to sometimes spend weeks, months,
oh,
years in the field.
exactly. And do you know the one thing that taught me the best lesson about this was when I went to the Great Barrier Reef. We're very lucky to have a field station on the Barrier Reef at One Tree Island, and normally we'd be sort of cruising around when we first get there, looking out for things and what have you. But actually, the time I saw the most animals was during a project which required me to stay absolutely still in the water for an hour or two at a time.
Wow.
And doing that, the
Yeah.
animals came to us. They
Yeah.
emerged from hiding, and suddenly I saw 10 times as much as I would have seen if I'd have been blundering around otherwise. So
And that's such a kind of operative part of field research too, is that you,
exactly,
as
yeah,
the researcher, you are present. There's kind of no
absolutely.
way to not be part of the equation, is there?
I mean, we can put cameras in, but frustratingly, the camera will get the tail of something charismatic or a brief glimpse of something shooting through the frame. It's they're not quite up there with the human eye in some respects.
Yeah, and you read stories about, drone footage in Yellowstone and how the drones actually negatively impact the
Exactly.
bears. They hear the sounds and they're annoying to them. Like all the different ways that we know to collect data, by and large, aren't innocuous.
Absolutely. In fact, I would, just going back to those cameras I was putting on the reef. There's a couple of occasions where you're watching the video back, and a fish will come up with the closest approximation a fish can make to an angry face and will peck the camera. So maybe the camera's making noise as well, or giving out electric field.
Right, things that we don't even notice. There is, of course, there's the kind of physiological component of social behavior too, that animals have ways of communicating that are kind of beyond the way that we perceive. So,
Exactly.
some animals can see in infrared or in ultraviolet, and we don't see those signals at all.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a mystery to us. They live in a world which we can barely imagine.
Oh, and I can imagine that many animals underneath the ocean surface have these kinds of like sonar abilities. Like you often hear about the way that our boats just completely disrupt the communication capacity of whales and dolphins across like large expanses of the ocean.
Sadly, yeah, there's been some research recently implicating searching for oil deposits under the sea, and the sonic tools that they use to do that can be really distressing to whales. So yeah, it is a problem, definitely.
Yeah, it's interesting. I even think about my own little guy, my dog, which he is not a wild animal, that's for sure. But he is a very social animal. We have definitely bred him to be one of the most social animals. Um, and I think about all the things that I don't notice, but that he notices when I'm watching television or when we're out on a walk and he obsesses over smells, or there's a sound that I barely hear, but he cocks his head and looks really distressed by it. That
Yeah,
he's privy to an entire world that I'm just unaware of.
Exactly, yeah, and that is something as an animal researcher you absolutely have to bear in mind. It's all too easy to superimpose our kind of sensory experience onto theirs, and to assume that, for instance, when you're on the reef and you look at all these bright coloured fish and you think, this is a really high predation environment. Why on earth are all these fish so brightly coloured? And then you have to remind yourself that this isn't how they see each other, and it's not how their predators see each other. And when you apply sort of corrections, artificial corrections, but corrections nonetheless, to get some idea or a better idea of how they see each other, then the whole picture changes. And so, yeah, all these animals living in their own sensory world, what we call an umwelt, it's so different to ours in so many ways.
It kind of opens up this grappling, this concept that I'm grappling with in my mind right now, and I can imagine that you grapple with as a researcher quite often. So bear with me as my brain meanders to my mouth and tries to communicate what I'm going to ask. I don't even know if this is going to be a question, but we'll see. So I'm thinking back to when I had Richard Prum on the show to talk about beauty in the animal kingdom and
Oh, yeah.
aesthetics. And when we talked quite a lot about evolutionary biology and, how animals communicate and what their sort of fitness is based on. And very often, I think we have a tendency, especially in the hard sciences, to say, okay, like you were just mentioning, like predation and reproduction and
Yeah.
these like core tenets to the life of an animal, that these are the only reasons that animals make any decisions. And then, of course, we know now that there is beauty and aesthetics, and some decisions within the animal kingdom are made based on things that we don't really fully understand from a purely kind of Darwinian perspective. Yet, we also have the tendency to go a little bit too far and anthropomorphize and say, oh, look at those animals, they're in love. Or, look, oh, he's feeling jealous. And like, how
Mm.
do you as a researcher grapple with these things? Like, we can't get inside of their heads. We just can't.
Yeah, no, you always have to sort of question yourself. You always have to sort of reset as well. Just as with reminding yourself that what we see, what we hear, and so on, how we sense the world is not necessarily how the animal is sensing it, and trying to keep that in mind. The same is true, really, I guess, of you know looking at animals' motivations, looking at what is are the driving forces for their behavior. So, exactly as you say, sometimes we can be too reductive, and we can say, if it's not about mating or avoiding being eaten or finding food, the three main imperatives, then obviously it can't possibly be of any importance to an animal. And at the same time, we've got to be careful about, as exactly as you say, going the other way, giving the animal a name and imputing all kinds of human emotions to it, and anthropomorphizing. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, as a scientist, I tend to go for the more reductive thing and think about what's the survival value of a particular behavior. But we can't rule out the possibility that animals sometimes do things simply because they're pleasurable. I mean, that makes absolute sense. It doesn't necessarily have to be about one of the three big imperatives. And we
Yeah, and
see
we
that
definitely
even
have
among,
examples, right?
yeah,
All the
yeah,
time.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So, it behoves us as researchers to just try and be, critical of ourselves, and to try and trying to avoid getting into a particular headset where we see only the simplest, the skeletons of animal behavior, and to try and understand them. The hardest thing for me, though, having said all that, is to try to avoid making inferences about what is an animal, what is motivating an animal. And that there's one particular thing with this, Cara, which is I was incredibly fortunate a few years ago to be involved in a project where we were looking at sperm whales. And that involved us getting in the water with the sperm whales. So what would happen, because of course they're carefully protected, just as they should be. There would be a lookout on the volcano. This is in the Azores, in the middle of the Atlantic, and he would be looking out for pods of sperm whales. He would radio that to the boat. They would look at the trajectory, and then they would drop us in the water, maybe half a kilometre in front of the whales, and the boat would get the hell out of the way. So after that, it was purely up to the whales. They could come up to us, or they could avoid us entirely. It was their choice, their ocean. In every case, they did come up to us. But there was this one phenomenal occasion where a group of 5 sperm whales, I think it was, came up to us and right in front of us started playing this game. The largest one, the matriarch, the leader of the group, the big female, she would open her mouth and the smaller members of the pod, presumably her daughters and potentially her granddaughters, would take it in turns to swim into her mouth sideways. She'd give them a little nibble, and then they'd swim clear, and then the next one would go through, and she'd give that one a nibble, and then join the back of the queue again. And there was this sort of circle of sperm whales swimming into her mouth and getting this nibble. And just as an aside, actually with that group for at least a few weeks was a dolphin with scoliosis. And that was engaging with the group as well. And that dolphin also swam into the matriarch's mouth, which was just quite incredible. Now, what motivated those animals to do that? Why would they do that? I can only speculate. I can't know what's going on inside a sperm whale's head. But, think about primates. They groom each other almost obsessively for anything up to a quarter of their day. Whales, of course, aren't equipped with limbs, so can't do that. So maybe this was some sort of tactile communication, some almost like I hesitate to say it, so please don't laugh at me, but almost like the whale equivalent of a cuddle. But
right, or maybe it was play, just
play, yeah,
play.
Quite, very, very possibly, yeah. They certainly they seem to be enjoying it, but I don't know what was going on in the whales' heads. I don't know what their motivation was, but it's hard not to speculate, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. And I mean, I think about examples of like primates getting drunk off of like fruit that's fermented.
Oh my God, yeah.
Animals seeking out like cool psychedelic experiences and going back for more and more. It's like, there's got to be something there, even if we can't put our finger on what it is.
Hey, do you know there's something really, really cool about that? I mentioned it in the book, but I forget exactly which kind of monkey it was now, just off the top of my head. I'm tempted to say it was vervets, but I can't be certain. But there are certain parts of the world where the vervets have basically taken to hanging around human habitations, and as a result, they get fairly easy access to alcohol. And it's really interesting that the population breakdown amongst those monkeys in terms of their treatment of alcohol is very, very similar to that of humans. So about 1 in 10 becomes a really, really, or can potentially be a really heavy drinker.
Oh, like an angry drunk.
Yeah,
no.
yeah.
Wow.
And about a third of them will drink recreationally, but know when to stop. And perhaps a third of them just refuse to touch it altogether. It just hilarious. Struck me as really interesting that their population breakdowns were very similar to that of humans.
And of course, we hear these examples quite a lot, and this gets to one of the main kind of cruxes. Is there a plural of crux? Yeah, I guess cruxes of the of your sort of, I don't know if I want to call it an argument, but of the thesis of your book. I often think about, and it's such the obvious example, so, forgive me, and hopefully we can get deeper into less obvious examples, but sort of the closest non-human primates to us are chimpanzees, but of course we also know about bonobos, which are very, very similar. They're just across the river, and yet their social behavior is so wildly different. We know that chimpanzees are quite cooperative, but often very warring. And we know that bonobos are quite cooperative and kind of like sexy time cooperative. And so when we think about these different examples, going to this sort of, like I mentioned, crux of your book, that so often we talk about animals as though they're constantly fighting each other. Like everything they're doing is to outcompete one another and win and make it to the top of the food chain and get all the best sex and make all the best babies. But very often animals have these kinship relationships, these cooperative relationships. We see like gay and lesbian relationships in the animal kingdom. We see individuals who are more tasked with child rearing and those who are more tasked with other sort of social roles. It's not just about competition, is it?
Absolutely not, no. And that's, it's an oft repeated phrase, nature red in tooth and claw. And people talk about, the essential aggressiveness of nature and the lack of kind of, empathy that exists among animals and things like that. And sometimes that gets translated into, books about business management and you know how to win, and unless you've climbed a ladder where every rung is the face of some competitor, then you haven't succeeded at all. And so we've often emphasized, we've drawn from the animal kingdom, we've looked at competition and aggressiveness sometimes, and first of all assumed that's how the animal kingdom is, and secondly we've used that as a as a means to motivate ourselves to go out there and fight and win, and all that kind of thing. But partly that comes from documentaries. So animal documentaries are obviously going to focus on the most arresting kind of animal behaviors. And of course, the most exciting animal behaviors are often when they're fighting. Think about, elephants, male elephant seals having a fight. That's, it's quite a box office thing. It's dramatic. It's much more dramatic than a lot of the things they're doing the rest of the time, for instance. But if we take a broader view, and if we look at, which are the most successful species of animals in the world, and look around, and nearly all of them are social. All, humans, of course, we are a very social species. Think about the most successful, shoals of fish. Fish tend to be the ones that shoal, and we might not think of, say, sardines as being particularly successful, but they're there in their millions and trillions.
Oh yeah.
Antarctic krill, the most successful crustacean. Social insects. All of these animals which have made a huge impact and have been hugely successful have got there because they're social, because they cooperate. That isn't to say it's an either or. If you're cooperative, you can't be aggressive. And as you said in your chimpanzee examples, there are animals who use both aspects of this. But again, chimpanzees themselves are successful because they cooperate. So, yeah, it's not so much that I want to preach a kind of either or message of you could either be aggressive or cooperative. It's
right.
It's just that we've overemphasized the one, in my opinion. We've overemphasized aggression and competition, and we've underemphasized the quieter, exactly as you put it, the sort of quieter, the more subtle aspects of cooperation.
Yeah, and in order to cooperate, though, I guess, I'm coming at this from a psychological perspective. And of course, was your training more in like zoology, or was it in ecology? Like, how did you get to animal behavior academically?
Well, my life was a series of dead ends and serendipitous turns, really. So, yeah, my bachelor's degree was in zoology. And if I'm absolutely honest, I didn't particularly enjoy it enormously. There seemed to be an awful lot of numbers, an awful lot of drawing of dead specimens and things like that, and very little actual live animals. And I actually met the person who eventually became my PhD supervisor during my degree, and suddenly everything sort of clicked into place. And it was he who trained me in, going from more broad zoology. He who trained me in sort of animal behavior, and I've never looked back since. But again, it's an example of, how we need these relationships in our lives to sort of plot and change the courses of our own lives. These relationships are of such critical importance. So yeah, my training originally was very general, but through this chance meeting with Jens Krause, my PhD supervisor, I became much more of an animal behaviorist.
I love that. And I feel like there is so much crossover with psychology, and some animal behaviors themselves were trained as psychologists first and sort of entered into that area from that direction. But as we were mentioning before, this risk, or this concern about anthropomorphizing and about kind of making assumptions about motivations or about thoughts and feelings as opposed to just behavior, which is what we can see. What is your, I guess, response to the question of theory of mind, the question of, animals that pass the mirror test, for example, or, do animals need to be able to understand another animal's thoughts and feelings to be able to behave cooperatively?
It's just such a fascinating area. I mean, it is naturally a tendency of us as humans to look at other animals and compare them to us and compare ourselves to them, indeed. And
we are animals, so there's some kind of
absolutely.
reason behind that, of course.
No, absolutely. And it is just fascinating. We can look around the animal kingdom, we can select examples such as elephants or dolphins or certain primates and examine their ability to, for instance, empathize with one another, to be able to understand and put themselves in the place of another individual. And that is, of course, fascinating. It's one of the most exciting areas of research. And yet, at the other extreme, animals don't necessarily need to have huge brains in order to be incredibly successful. Animals, brains tend to be an extremely expensive bit of organic kit, if you like. So the brain weighs, only a fraction of our overall weight, perhaps something like, 2%, but uses 20% of our energy. It's an expensive thing to run. I think I read that it uses the same energy as the leg muscles of a marathon runner whilst they're running a marathon. So it's constantly burning that energy. Now, if animals don't need that kind of huge brain, then they don't tend to be equipped with it. But that doesn't make them less successful. It just makes them probably less able to empathize, perhaps, in certain instances. So, yeah, I guess I see it from both points of view. I do think it's fascinating to look at the evolution of intelligence and to look at animals similar to ourselves and to look at the results of things like the mirror test, where animals can differentiate between self and other. But I also think it's important to remember that intelligence isn't the only or necessarily the most important thing that animals have evolved.
Right, right. And I guess it opens up this question that we sort of referenced earlier on when we were talking about a murmuration of starlings versus a group of birds that's migrating and has sort of like these elder birds that are leading the way, that they
Yeah.
know the course. Like maybe you can help us understand the difference between what's happening in a murmuration or a school versus what's happening when there is this sort of like wisdom, this culture being passed along.
Yeah, so a murmuration is just, I presume you see them in North America.
Oh yeah, we see them all the time. They're so cool.
They're wonderful, aren't they? They're just extraordinary. Now, what's happening with these things usually is that the animals are, it often occurs towards the end of the day, and it's often just before the animals come into roost. And it's been speculated that it's an anti-predator strategy, really, to confuse predators. But whatever it is, it's a beautiful scene. But really, what's happening there is basic self-organization. The animals aren't necessarily conceptualizing the overall group and how it looks as much as we might think it would be lovely if they were performing an aerial ballet for us. Mm-hmm. They're simply responding to the movements of near neighbors, and they're swooping and swooshing this way and that.
So it's literally the trees, not the forest for them. It's just right in front of them and who's right to their left.
Exactly, yeah. Okay. But then eventually some movement will be made by one individual or a small group of individuals who will descend to the roost, and then the whole thing will, they'll leave the skies and come into roost. And if they do that kind of in an organized way, then they've got less chance necessarily of being picked off. Now, when it comes to migrating birds, particularly in medium to large sized birds, which often fly in Vs or things like that, you often do get experienced individuals who will lead the way for less experienced individuals who have less information about where they're going. And there's been all sorts of wonderful research about that, about how, the younger members of the group will follow and take information from those more experienced birds and use that as a means to guide them to their place of safety. And one of the most difficult things, think about whooping cranes, for instance. They almost went extinct. And one of the challenges in order to rehabilitate them is to be able to, instill that kind of deep historical cultural knowledge in some of the birds so that they can start to follow their old migration routes and do the things that made whooping cranes successful in the first place. So, yeah, it's a fascinating difference among all of these species. Yeah.
When I think back to like this concept of this self-organization, these murmurations, I can't help but make a connection to some of the, molecular biological processes that happen within our own bodies. I remember recently having a biophysicist on the show, Raghavir Parthasarathi, and he wrote a book called So Simple a Beginning: How Four Physical Principles Shape Our Living World. And one of those principles was self-assembly, and another was predictable randomness. That there are these kind of patterns that exist, whether we're talking about at the molecular level or at large systems level, wherein actor one is reacting to actor two, to actor three, to actor four. And because of that, you see a gestalt from the outside, but there's no kind of overall organization to it. It's simply just, following the leader, which
Yeah,
is
pretty much.
fascinating.
Oh, it is so interesting. Yeah. I mean, when we first saw murmurations of starlings, people were assuming that they made the assumption that they were kind of connecting to some kind of collective mind, some kind of
Right.
invisible minds that they were all following independently to make these incredible patterns that they make in the sky. What's actually happening, which I think is actually more fascinating, really, is that it's really much more simple than that. Each bird is looking at the behavior of up to 7 near neighbors and
Mm-hmm.
essentially copying what they do and aligning with them. And that's enough to produce these phenomenal things. But one of the most incredible examples, I think, and the one I would consider that's possibly closest to your analogy to molecular systems, is what happens amongst termites. A single termite has no idea that it's building a termite mound. It hasn't got a clue. It can't, it can't begin to conceptualize anything of that level of complexity. And yet the termites build these mounds. And, if a termite mound gets damaged, the animals follow these really simple heuristics, these simple rules of thumb. If they feel a breeze coming in, an unwanted breeze from outside, a little termite will go collect some damp mud, roll it into a ball, go to the place that the draft is coming from, and put that wet ball down next to another wet ball, if there is another wet ball there, and then it'll run back and get another one until the draft stops. That termite doesn't know that it's mending a hole in the termite mound. It simply responds to some of those very, very simple rules. And yet the result of that we see is not only a termite mound, which is impressive from the outside, but seen from the inside, a termite mound is one of the most incredible not archaeological, sorry. One of the most incredible building feats that you could possibly imagine.
Yeah.
It has ventilation systems. It has different chambers. It has all these incredible things, none
They're
of
also
which
enormous. So they're completely
huge.
complex, but they're enormous, and they're the smallest little creature. I don't think I really appreciated that until I visited Southern Africa. And I remember stopping on the side of the road and taking pictures next to these bananas termite mounds that are like twice my height.
It's amazing, and each little termite is probably no longer than the width of your fingernail, and
That's
they've built that.
amazing.
And sometimes
Amazing.
they can last for over a millennium. There are
Ugh.
some termite mounds which last that long, and they're built simply of mud and spit.
I mean, talk about social beings, like these beings that are cooperative, whether they can understand the greater organization or they're doing what you mentioned, right? Which is that they are just kind of almost programmed to react to stimulation and do what needs to be done, based on their evolution. But regardless, they are producing like social relics in a way. They're producing actual, like you said the word archaeology, and then laughed about it because it's not human made, but they are producing these physical structures that have permanence.
Yeah, I mean, actually, when I said archaeology, I meant architecture. But
But there is something kind of archaeological to it, although it's not by a human.
yeah, no, absolutely there is, and there is a field of sort of zoological archaeology as well, that looks at these kinds of things. But yeah, the animals don't necessarily need to be of a positive mindset and to be thinking in glowing terms of near neighbors and things like that in order for them to cooperate. Cooperation simply comes naturally to some species, and it rewards those who engage in it with greater fitness. So, it becomes selected for by natural selection. So, they don't necessarily need to be kind and giving individuals. It's
Right.
something simply that works.
Yeah, and it again, this is going to be another one of those kind of big picture grappling. So see if you can't follow me along as I try to connect my brain to my mouth. earlier you mentioned this very human way that when we first saw murmurations, we said, oh, there must be some sort of hive mind, right? There must be some sort of greater intelligence that they're tapping into, and whether that's like a cosmic consciousness. And you still see obviously persistence of viewpoints of things like cosmic consciousness in different religious ideologies, and even some kind of more bizarre psychological ideologies. And so I'm coming at this as a sort of staunch humanist, atheist, behaviorist who also celebrates constructivism and celebrates empathy and kind of the human experience. Um, uh, the more I learn about the natural world, the more my own personal ideologies, my own personal kind of secularism evolves. And, not to out you or anything, but I'm definitely curious how studying animals has changed your perspective of human beings, of your place in the cosmos, of your, maybe even your ideology, your religion, your spirituality.
Oh, goodness. That's such an interesting question. I've never been asked that before. So I guess as a small child, the thing that always made me happiest was to be finding animals and looking at them and looking at what they did and, just watching their behavior. That was always wonderful. I mean, I mentioned in the book right at the start, I had this tendency to just really get fixated on a particular scene. And there was this one day I was lying down on my front looking into a stream, and I wasn't even conscious of the time passing, but I must have been there quite some time without moving. And after a sort of reverie lasting I've no idea how long it was, but after this long reverie of a considerable period, I looked up and I came face to face with a stoat.
Ooh,
The
I love
stoat had been so still, the stoat had come down to drink at the water, and it was maybe, just 6 inches from my face.
And how old were you?
I was probably about 10 or 11 years old.
Oh.
And I looked into the face of this stoat, and it looked at me, and it was horrified. I mean, often people say that when they look at my face, but the stoat, the stoat jumped in the air and scarpered off. But yeah, I mean that.
I have to interrupt real quick. Sorry, I have to interrupt just to for the North American listeners, because you, if they haven't been able to tell yet, although you are in Sydney, you are from the north of England, right? That is not an Australian accent. A stoat in the UK is a weasel in the US. We don't call them stoats. So most people are like, yes. What is a stoat?
Yeah,
so he's talking about a little weasel. Yeah,
so
cute.
a pocket-sized otter, if you like, but not an aquatic one. So I spent so much of my childhood doing this, and that was, that was what filled my heart with happiness, to get outside there and to look at animals. But as I approached adulthood, I completely lacked confidence in myself. I lacked, I guess you would say, the drive to go and follow this as a career. I didn't think it was for people like me. I thought it was, you had to be independently wealthy and all that kind of thing. So I went off into the world, got a job, put those days behind me, never lost my love of animals. And it was only through a series of I guess, unpredictable events that life throws up that I found myself in my mid-20s back at university, or going back in education and going to university, something I swore that I would never do because it wasn't for people like me. And finding myself able to indulge what felt like a slightly, selfish, if you like, to look after my own interests, to do this kind of thing. But nonetheless, I did it, and that was the starting point for where I am now. So, that was. I've been wrong about so many things in my life, but turning my back on the thing that made me the happiest, in other words, studying animals, was one of the biggest mistakes, if not the biggest mistake I ever made.
So you rectified it.
I rectified it in the end, but not through a singular purpose of mind or anything like that. It was really just a series of chance events, and then a lucky meeting with Jens Krauser. Otherwise, things would have been completely different. But in terms of spirituality and sort of repositioning myself in the cosmos, if you like, I think animals have always been the thing that have sort of grounded me, have most interested me. And I see in their behavior a lot of the things, which we take sometimes as being uniquely human behaviors. And so, we talk about human communication. The way that we're speaking now is, of course, more complex, at least in its details, than animals can manage. But we're wrong if we think that animals can't communicate complex messages. There's been some fascinating research that's been done just lately with sperm whales. And when I was with the sperm whales would swim up to you and make these sounds. And it was always the same sounds. Now, were they trying to communicate, or were they just investigating us with sonar? Probably the latter, but maybe they were trying to communicate. And it's such a privilege to get the chance to do that kind of thing. And so, I guess animals have taken the place in my life that in other people's lives is occupied by, say, religion or by, other sort of spiritual activities. So, yeah, I think, I wouldn't criticize or hector somebody for being religious in the slightest. It's not for me. That role is filled by other things, by animals, by animal behavior, and by science.
Yeah, and you get that awe and that sense of meaning and
Oh, so
purpose
much.
from that work.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's interesting because it almost kind of speaks to this idea that I'm linking these two thoughts in my mind. But earlier we were talking about grappling with not anthropomorphizing the animals too much or trying to assume things about their thoughts, their feelings, their motivations. We cannot empathize with them fully because they cannot tell us what they're thinking and feeling. Right? There's a by definition there's the sort of barrier there.
Yeah, there's a species barrier for
There's a
sure.
species barrier. Yeah. So we can't say, okay, because humans this, then, definitely elephants this. But what we can say is sort of the other way around. We can observe species that aren't human and draw understandings from them, take what we can from them, and then we can turn around and say, well, we as thinking, feeling, poetic, artistic, musical animals can make sense of our own experience. So how can what we learn from the animals inform our human existence? We can grapple with that.
We can and we should. I mean, it behoves us as the intelligent beings that we are, the intelligent animals that we are, to be able to at least try to understand the perspective of an animal. For the longest time, we would treat the animals that were around us with something close to contempt. We would,
like pests.
yeah, we would dispatch pests and even animals which are close to us. I'm thinking about obviously pets, but more particularly here, sort of the farm animals around us. Animals like cattle, for instance, don't show a massive amount of emotion. And one of the reasons that they don't is that to express pain or to express injury in the wild state is to draw attention to yourself from a predator. So it's a bit like when a person, I mean, not that I've experienced of this, but when a person first goes to jail, they've got to have a kind of a jail face on so that they don't look weak, so they don't get picked on by whoever's whoever's at the top of that pecking order.
Right,
And so it is
AKA
with
eaten by a puma. They don't want that. Yeah.
maybe, but
Yeah.
but yeah, in the wild cattle, they had to mask their certain weaknesses, so they appear to us to be relatively stoic. But if you know what you're looking for, you can find signs of stress and of suffering in these animals. Sometimes it might
Oh,
be
well, and of
something
course,
as
if we
simple as showing the whites of their eyes or what have you. You can tell if you look closely enough. And I think, like I said earlier, it behoves us to try harder to understand what makes these animals tick and wherever possible to try and make their experience better.
Yeah, and clearly we have examples within our own culture that we can turn to, and just spend some time in India and see how cows are treated in India, and see how connected the people are to the cows in India, and clearly certain individuals on the streets there can see emotion the way that we don't, because we don't have that exposure. Or even, honestly, if you spend any time in Scotland and you see those lovely Highland coos, they're so beloved, and their
Yeah.
caretakers are so close. They're like pets. They treat them like big dogs, and it's just the sweetest thing you've ever seen. But we don't often think of that when we're, I don't know, here in the US or in the UK or in Australia, and we're thinking of dairy cows or meat cows or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, we could pack it off to one side of our mind and give it little thought, and that's understandable. We don't necessarily want to think about killing an animal every time we get a steak. It tends to suppress the appetite a little bit if you're of that particular mindset. But yeah, I just think it's worthwhile to at least try to understand the experience of other animals. Using our exceptional intelligence to try and unpick the secrets of their lives and to try and use that to make their lives better wherever possible, and to be less cavalier, let's say, in our treatment of them.
Yeah, and so clearly, kind of as a big picture takeaway, I can't imagine that you're not informing your daily life, your decision making, based on the work that you do. But I'm curious if there are any examples that you might be able to share with us here as we're sort of wrapping out the conversation about, ways that you are different because of your work, ways that you think differently about the world, or anything that's been impressed upon you that maybe prior to going back into academia and really spending this time with these different species, maybe you didn't think about, like the expression of a cow, for example.
Yeah, I mean that single example is something that I definitely learned. We've long throughout human history had this idea of human exceptionalism. We think, and to some extent, we're taught that on the one hand there's animals, and on the other hand there's us. And I think if my career has taught me anything, is just what a fallacy that is. How great the overlap and how little the differences are between ourselves and the rest of the animal kingdom. So I think it's perhaps not been an absolute sea change for me, because I was always, a huge animal fan, but I've found example after example after example of cases in which animals have surprised and astonished me in some cases. I was lucky enough to go to study humpbacks in the Pacific, and I watched as this huge female humpback, maybe 10 meters in length, like a school bus,
Mm-hmm.
and she'd found herself a little branch floating in the ocean, and she was playing with it like a kitten. It was extraordinary, and these things that you don't necessarily think of. Or another occasion on that same trip, there was a male singing his courtship song, and I got in the water with him, and he completely fluffed his lines. So animals aren't perfect either. He was singing this song which sounded like a pig coming around from a hangover. It was just awful. It was
Grab
hideous.
them with like the cane, like those old vaudeville shows. Like,
Yeah, it was atrocious. I mean, I
yeah.
didn't think I'd ever meet another organism which was worse at singing than me, but there he was. So it's seeing animals not only in their sort of majesty and how incredible they can be, but also in their vulnerability and their playfulness, and occasionally their ability to fluff their lines. It just all adds up to this incredibly fascinating picture in from my point of view of just how wonderful animals are. I mean, one big change that I did make was to become a vegetarian, which was something I never thought I would do. And obviously that is a very personal choice for every person. But there came a point where I thought I can't really study these animals and just not. And then switch off and go for dinner. So that was a change that I made. So yeah, but really, to your broader question, I think I somehow was born with this love of animals, and the knowledge that I've acquired during my career has only sort of enhanced that. I think it's just been the most wonderful career to date that I could possibly have imagined.
Mm. And really, your book, The Social Lives of Animals, that is what it is. It's a celebration of the exceptionalism of animals, really, and kind of in celebrating them, maybe a little bit of an exercise in human humility as well.
Absolutely, yeah. That's the whole point of it. I think really the book I tried to communicate was not only my love of animals, but also just how fascinating they are, and to try and relate that to people so they get some sense of just how excited I get in the presence of animals, and hopefully they would too. Absolutely.
So I close my episode by asking my guests the same two big picture questions, which we're going to
Okay.
do. But before we do that, I have to ask you, and I'm not trying to open up a can of worms here right at the end. So we don't have to spend any time talking about zoos and what zoos are and what they represent and what the ethical kind of conversation around zoos is. I mean, my view, and you take it or leave it, is that there are terrible zoos, but there are some really good zoos that are doing amazing work for conservation. And all zoos are not created equal. But I ask you this: when you are in a situation where you are either in a natural environment observing for your work, or where you are in an attempted natural environment, which, as we know, sadly has to be an artificial environment, where you are observing species in a zoo or something like that,
Yeah.
what is your favorite animal to observe?
Oh my goodness. Right. Well, I'm going to start by, by just quickly mentioning your longer point. I tend to agree with you completely. And here I diverge from some of my colleagues in the sense that, there are some people who are hardline people who simply want to see zoos abolished. My take on that is exactly as you say. I would like bad zoos to be either improved or closed, but I think zoos potentially do a huge amount of good.
But if we
Um,
abolish them altogether, we would lose species. There would
yeah,
literally be animals that would no longer exist because we don't have zoos, sadly.
exactly. And as the old saying goes, we protect what we love and we love what we understand. And if we never encounter certain animals, then our appreciation of them, for some people, for the general public, their appreciation of these animals declines and makes conservation all the harder. What's the most impressive animal that I've seen, though?
Yeah, which
Oh,
one do you just
goodness.
enjoy? Like, what could you just sit and watch for hours?
Oh, I think I could watch anything for hours, actually. When it comes to animals, I've got an incredibly high boredom threshold. Um, I think coming face to face with sperm whales was
Oh
just
gosh,
spine
I can
tingling.
imagine.
Just in
Wow.
the middle of the ocean in this glassy clear water, it's maybe a kilometre or two deep. There's nothing for miles around but you and a sperm whale. And the
That
sperm
sounds
whale is
kind of horrifying to me, if I have to be honest. Like, it sounds amazing, but also really scary.
well, I had some trepidation at first because in the Azores they only really stopped hunting. I think I'm right in saying, I apologise if I offend any Azorians, but I think they only actually fully stopped hunting in the late 80s, early 90s. Now, animals that live as long as sperm whales do, which is approximately the same age as us, the older ones will have had experience of being hunted by people. And so I had some trepidation getting in the water with them, but they were gentle and curious. And, one of the most worrying things, if you think about bears and bear cubs and what can happen, is that we were swimming back to the boat one time and the boat was a long way off. So we were just cruising along. And a sperm whale calf on its own came up to us. Um, and me and my buddy. And we can't outswim it. It's only a newborn, but it's quite a bit bigger than us, and it can outswim us. And it was playing with us. It was swimming around us. It was swimming through our legs. It was nudging us. And I thought, my God, when its enormous mother appears, what on earth is going to happen? But she did appear, and everything was fine. But I think I could have watched that calf. I could have watched the other sperm whales. I could have watched them indefinitely. But there's such a long list of animals that I could watch indefinitely. That
Oh, I can
um,
imagine.
yeah.
When I've had the opportunity to do, to be in wild places in Southern Africa, in South America. Like, I've traveled quite extensively and I've been very, very lucky in that regard. And so I've been on safari and I've watched a leopard and and there have been so
Fantastic.
many incredible experiences. But when I'm in a more confined space like a zoo, I have to say I struggle with primates. They make me sad
Yeah,
watching primates in
yeah.
enclosures. And even elephants. I mean, sometimes they have quite good enclosures, but they're never good enough, in my view. But I have to say, I love watching river otters. I'm
Oh,
obsessed with river otters. They're so fun. They're like play on steroids. They're the most playful animals I've ever encountered.
when an otter's moving, it's really taking that movement seriously. It's going all in, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got to
They
love
play
an
with their
otter.
food, they play with their toys, they play
Oh,
with each other. And our Los Angeles Zoo has a really great giant river otter enclosure that has big slides. And they
oh,
love to just climb to the top and slide to the bottom, and climb to the top and slide to the
oh,
bottom.
that's
It
just
makes me so
glorious,
happy.
isn't it?
Yeah.
I
Anyway,
did
well,
I did see in a zoo recently
mhm.
some hyenas. Now, hyenas are an animal which I've a lot of people um, think of them in less than glowing terms. Think of
Yeah,
them
we
as
definitely
being
don't think of them as like beautiful creatures.
no. But I mean, when I went to Africa the first time, that was the animal. Those and hippos were the two animals that I really wanted to see, and I have to say, in this particular enclosure, that it was a big enclosure which made me happy, and the hyenas looked super healthy. But there was a glass window there, and I was able to basically sit at the glass window on a level with the hyenas, and that was really wonderful. I'd seen them at a distance, of course, in Africa, but this was, being within half a meter of a hyena was quite incredible, and the size of them and the size of their jaws really really kind of astonished me. They were beautiful. So I guess without the zoo experience, I would never have done that. So
Yeah, we do
yeah,
have some of those, even, in Australia, I remember visiting oh gosh, I'm gonna screw it up now. Is it Phillip Island? Is that a
Phillip
place?
Island,
Someplace
yeah,
yeah, where they
yeah,
had the little blue penguins?
yes, that's it.
Oh
Yeah,
my
I've been
and
there.
I went to this, place where you're in an enclosure and it's level and they all come out of the ocean late at night and they have their sea legs, so they fall flat on their face over and over in front of and they're the cutest things you've ever seen. And you never would have that perspective of them if not
No,
for being able to travel to that area and pay the money that goes towards the conservation and, get down in there and hunker down and observe these incredible, incredible animals.
yeah, the wonderful thing about the little penguins as they come out, of course, is that they've then got to run the gauntlet of getting from the edge of the sea up into their burrows in the in the dunes. But what they do very, very cleverly, which comes back, I guess, to sociality, is that they wait at the water's edge until they've got a critical mass of them, so they can run across the beach in a group, so that the seabirds and the gulls that would mob them and try and get them to empty their crops and rob them of their food don't get the chance to do so because they cross in a group. So that was so cool to watch.
Ah,
Wonderful
so
animals.
cool. They're just the cutest things you've ever seen. They're so tiny.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, I can't keep you much longer. So Ashley, I do ask my guests the same two questions at the end of every show, and they're sort of big picture questions, but I want you to answer in whatever context is relevant to
Okay.
you right in this moment. So this could be personal, it could be local, it could be national, it could be global, it could be cosmic.
Oh
Um,
goodness. Right.
or it could have to do with your work or not. So I want you to tell me when you think about the future in again whatever context is relevant to you right now. Number one, what is the thing that is keeping you up the most at night, the thing you're most concerned about, maybe even pessimistic, borderline cynical about? But then so that we can end on a happier note, where are you finding your optimism? Where are you finding your hope? What are you actually looking forward to?
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Should have warned
So
you.
in terms of recent news events, obviously what's going on in Ukraine is something which is enormously concerning, and it just seems that as a species we seem to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. The Russians basically doing to the Ukrainians what the Nazis did to them at the Stalingrad. It's just horrific. So that is profoundly sort of depressing and disappointing. From the perspective of a nature lover and as a biologist stroke zoologist, then inevitably seeing the effects of climate change beginning to take hold and still seeing a small cadre of people, but a vocal cadre of people saying that it's all a hoax and refusing to engage with it. And you just feel like banging your head against a wall. And how much evidence is enough? How many glasses have to melt before these idiots kind of stop their nonsense and just, we can still achieve some kind of redress, some kind of hope for the future if we just work together. So that those are the sorts of things that keep me up at night. Could you just remind me of the second one, how you phrased it, please?
Yeah, just where are you finding your hope and your optimism? What are you looking forward to?
So inevitably that comes my hope and inspiration, as so often, comes from animals, and but not just animals. I mean, I've spoken extensively about animals, but in my job, I see an awful lot of very committed people, from the students that I teach to the people that I see working in the field, who are devoting themselves to the conservation of habitats and of species, and in that kind of passion that they express for what they're doing, I find a great deal of hope in that. There are lots of people with a real zeal and a mission to improve the lot of animals, and I do find that enormously hopeful. And part of my job as an educator and part of my job as an author is to just say to people, look how amazing this is, how incredible the natural world is, and it's so worth celebrating, and it's there for everyone. Just go out and see it. So I think those are the sorts of things that give me hope.
Absolutely. Yeah, it costs you nothing. Just walk outside. I love it. Gosh. Well, everyone, the book is The Social Lives of Animals by Dr. Ashley Ward. Ashley, thank you so much for being here with us today.
That was a great pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.